What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today I'm absolutely honored to introduce you all to United Church minister turned whistleblower, Canadian hero, father of two, published writer and author, public speaker and podcaster, documentary filmmaker, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, co-founder of the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, righteous soul, and eagle strong voice, Kevin Annett. A United Church minister turned relentless whistleblower, Kevin stands as a towering figure in the fight for truth and justice. For decades, this Canadian hero we get to hear from today has fearlessly exposed the dark underbelly of his nation's history, the systematic genocide of Indigenous children in church-run Indian residential schools. At immense personal cost, Kevin has become a beacon of hope for survivors, a thorn in the side of the powerful, and a catalyst for global awakening. Born with a fierce sense of justice, Kevin's journey began in the 1990s when, as a minister in Port Alberni, British Columbia, he uncovered harrowing accounts of abuse, murder, and cultural annihilation inflicted upon Indigenous children. What he discovered shattered his world. A deliberate campaign by church and state to erase people, with a staggering 50% death rate in the schools, a truth later confirmed by the Globe and Mail in 2007. Unwilling to stay silent, Kevin embarked on a mission that would cost him his career, his family, and his reputation, but would also ignite a movement that could not be extinguished. In 1998, Kevin convened the first independent tribunal into residential school crimes in Vancouver, a groundbreaking effort that recommended genocide charges against Canada and its churches to the United Nations. He founded the Truth Commission into Genocide in Canada in 2000, authored the seminal book Hidden from History, The Canadian Holocaust in 2001, and released the award-winning documentary Unrepentant in 2007, which shocked the world with its raw testimonies and undeniable evidence. His work forced an official apology from the Canadian government in 2008, though the establishment quickly erased his name from the narrative. Undeterred, Kevin went global. In 2010, he co-founded the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, uniting survivors across 26 countries to hold the Vatican, the British Crown, and Canadian leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. His efforts led to the 2011 evacuation of children's bones at a mass grave in Brantford, Ontario, and the historic 2012 prosecution of Pope Benedict and others by the International Common Law Court of Justice. Kevin's courage even sparked the resignation of Pope Benedict, a testament to the power of his unrelenting pursuit of justice. Despite facing blacklisting, smear campaigns, and state persecution, including a fraudulent COVID isolation order in 2021 that saw his bank account and devices disabled, Kevin has never wavered. He has authored over a dozen books, including Murder by Decree, and founded the Republic of Canada in 2015 as a sovereign alternative to Canada's colonial regime. Nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize and for the Order of Canada in 2021, Kevin's legacy is one of fearless resistance against tyranny and a call to action for humanity to confront its darkest truths. Today, Kevin continues to fight, inspiring millions to join the movement to end genocide, child trafficking, and systemic oppression. His story is a testament to the power of one voice to change the world, a voice that refuses to be silenced no matter the cost. Before wrapping up the introduction of today's guest, I'd love to share just a couple quick reminders and updates. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, if you wanted to share any information privately with me, or if you were interested in submitting a written testimony for my upcoming book series or to be featured on a Substack article, you can reach out to me via email at imagineabetterworld2020@gmail.com or standbysurvivors@protonmail.com. Additionally, I've teamed up with a couple of my favorite brands to offer you guys exclusive discount codes on products I love, such as Rife Technology frequency machines and CZTL's premium methylene blue. You can find all the relevant links and codes along with other resources in the show notes. Your support across all platforms is greatly appreciated, especially as I've had to shift to alternative streaming platforms such as Rumble and X following the termination of my former YouTube channel. I've just recently started a new YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to me there at the handle at Imagination Podcast Official that I will be and am currently rebuilding as well. This transition to multiple platforms is crucial to continue sharing vital information with the public and disclosure community. So thank you all on the other side of the screen wholeheartedly for helping to make the imagination the safest space on the internet for survivor, whistleblower, advocate, and educator disclosures. Your support means the absolute world to me and to every guest on the show. So, you guys, without further ado, please help me in welcoming today's guest of honor, voice for the voiceless, relentless victim and survivor advocate, passionate purveyor of truth, content creator, absolute warrior, and a man whose actions speak louder than any words. The one, the only, Kevin Annett. Kevin, thank you so much for being here today. It's such an honor to have you.
Emma, I've never had such a glowing introduction, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. I feel like I could have written a whole book on your biography. It's so impressive,
Mhm.
the body of work that you've done and your relentlessness to just continue going year after year, all these decades, And I know
Mhm.
today we're just going to sort of get to scratch the surface on your work. And you have so much content on there that I'm going to link in the show notes for people, including websites. You do have a documentary, you have over a dozen books. And we'll talk a little bit about that later too. But I wanted to give people who maybe watch my show and haven't watched any of your content an intro to you and to sort of, start talking about your story and how you ended up uncovering this absolutely heinous crimes against humanity that you've been advocating for all these years. So I want to give a little bit of background on you and, to maybe share how you got into ministry. I know that
Yeah.
you went to college and had political science and a couple other majors that you were looking to accomplish, and your whole life took a turn. So I wanted to share a little bit about that and start getting into this part of your story.
Thank you. Well, for me, it began when I was a child. Really, we grew up in Winnipeg in central Canada, and on my mom's side, we were Scottish settlers who intermarried with the Cree and the Ojibwe Indians back in the 1800s. So I had relatives and in-laws, who were in that world, and so I began to learn about these things really at a young age. Um, I remember once when I was being raised in the United Church, I asked in the Sunday school class, how come our church killed so many Indians? And that got me expelled from church, you know, because I'd heard stories from my ancestors about that happening, about how the ceremonies were outlawed and the RCMP would come in and arrest, the traditional elders and you'd never see them again. So I was raised with all this knowledge, but in Canada, especially, it's not like in America where there's kind of a built-in questioning about authority and the government about that. It's quite the opposite in Canada. People are raised to believe you're a subject of the crown. You're not a citizen. You're a dependency on this one monarch. We've never kind of outgrown the Middle Ages in that sense. So when you go up against the church and government in Canada, you're really offending a lot of people or scaring a lot, right? And so the other thing that really activated me into this is even before I was a minister, as a teenager, we went on a tour up to northern British Columbia when I lived in Vancouver. This is on the West Coast. And we went to a village there of the Tsimshian Native people up near Alaska. And what I saw there was just unbelievable. I had never thought that there was that kind of poverty and violence in Canada before. Children looking like something out of the third world, and the level of violence, and it just totally shattered my old world. And what also shattered my world is the fact that everyone around me in the so-called white world were all in denial about it, right? And you're not supposed to look at that stuff. So that kind of led me right away. The first degree I got was anthropology because I wanted to understand better, right? And I was also very much an activist, in a lot of human rights stuff and political stuff. So it was open to these influences. And after I got my poli-sci degree, I wanted to go into law, but then something happened where I just had this urge to broaden myself spiritually. I didn't want to teach my whole life or be a lawyer. I wanted to go into that, so that I went into the ministry when I was in my late 20s. And I didn't have a burning bush spiritual experience. I just wanted to kind of explore that more, but also find a way to be working directly with people, and you know, combining all those things. So I was married at the same time. My wife Anne and I, my wife at the time Anne, um, we had two daughters, Claire and Eleanor, and I did some postings around when I got ordained into the United Church. Now they're like the United Church of Christ in America. They're like the largest Protestant denomination, and they had a long history of running these places. They like to call them residential schools. They weren't. They weren't schools. They were death camps for Native children. The death rate was on average twice that of Auschwitz. Half the children would go in and never come out again, deliberately being killed off. And um, the United Church, the Catholics, they run most of them, and the Anglican or the Church of England. I think you call them Episcopalians in America. But anyway, uh, I get ordained in the United Church. I go work and do some street ministry in Toronto. And then I get an opening to a place called Port Alberni, which is kind of the scene of the crime. This is where it all began for me. And Port Alberni is like a lumber town on Vancouver Island. So you're talking like northwest of Seattle, up along the Pacific coast, heading towards Alaska. And I got a request for minister from a church. They were a dying congregation. They were older people. There were only 10 people there on Sunday. I had had a history of doing street ministry and community ministry in Vancouver, so they wanted me to bring new blood into the church. And I was hired on that basis. I said, okay, fine. So one of the first things I did is I opened up the church to the Aboriginal community, which is about a third of the population, but you never saw them anywhere. It was like apartheid. There were never any whites and natives mixing anywhere. They kept to themselves on the reservation and in town. You never saw natives working in the stores or going to church, which I thought was kind of odd. So I began to increase the size of the church. Within a few months, we're up to 80 people on Sunday. And one of the first homes I was invited into was a native home. And I described this in my documentary, Unrepentant. A man called Danny Gus, he was a fisherman, native fisherman. And he had been living with Clotilde, his partner, for 30 years. But he said, well, I want to make her respectable now. I think we should time to get married, right? So we were sitting in his living room after I did the marriage ceremony and having salmon and tea. And he kept looking out the window at the hill behind the school. And I didn't know at the time it's where the Alberni residential school had been, this internment camp where all the children had to go or the parents went to jail. It was like a camp, a jail, really. And I asked Danny kind of innocently, I've noticed there are none of your people in any of the churches. How come there's no mixing going on? And he didn't say anything for a long time. And finally he said, they killed my best friend in that school over there. He's buried in the hill out there with a lot of other kids. And the whites know it. They just don't want us in the church. So, that blew my mind. And then every native home I went into after that, I heard the same stories. Every native family had a story like that. Yet they weren't, I thought, how could something so big be hidden for so long, right? And I began to learn why. As soon as I began to talk about this, I got threatened by church officials. They said, look, you have a young family. My youngest daughter, Eleanor, had been born the month we got there. So my daughters were like a newborn and a 3-year-old. And they also went to my wife, Anne, and threatened her, which I didn't learn till later. They said, if Kevin keeps on with this stuff, he's never going to work again. So if you want to leave him, nudge, nudge, we'll be happy to help you. And that came out later in the divorce court and everything. So they were doing what you do with a whistleblower. They're kind of getting their ducks in order to make sure that we wipe out his family, wipe out his livelihood, and then we'll shut up any kind of truth coming out about this. If you want to jump in with questions or comments, go ahead at any point because it's kind of a long narrative. But
No, I think, like you said, this really does fit in with a lot of whistleblower testimonies. And I think that's an important part of your story is all the threats and retaliation because, I think somebody like you genuinely thought people would care about this. And I think it's really shocking when you're a humanitarian at heart. You're sharing something that you think is going to affect people and people are going to feel the same way as you and say, "Oh my gosh, this is happening. how has this been hidden? We didn't know about it. Let's all get together and change it. And, to be
That's right.
faced with kind of like the opposite reaction can be so disheartening and horrible, especially when that's not something that you were used to. You weren't a criminal. You led a really good life. You were really decorated. You had, a good head on your shoulders. You had a family. You weren't out there committing crimes, and here you are being treated like a criminal and, having everything stripped away from you simply for doing the right thing.
Well, exactly. And in a way, I often say, Emma, to people that naivety can be a good ally for you, because if I'd have known back then everything I know now, you naturally don't want to go into places where you're going to lose your family and your kids are going to be taken from you and that. But being naive, you go into places that you don't expect, and that you grow from it as long as you persist. And that was the key, that if you persist long enough, you learn things and you get stronger. To make it concrete, this little girl, Vicky Stewart, was in a United Church school in Edmonton, and she was 9 years old when her sister told me this story. She was coming into the residential school too slow, so a matron called Ann Kaniski picked up a 2x4, hit her on the head with it, and she passed out. And during the night, she died. And Charlotte, her sister, told me this in her home, that when they at home, the body was shipped back, and the death certificate said tuberculosis, right, which was common. It was an introduced disease, and a lot of Native people died from it. But Charlotte remembers when they opened the coffin and saw Vicky's body, the skull cap fell back, and there was no brain, because they had to remove it to remove any evidence that she'd been killed. And I often think of Vicky like she'd be in her 70s now with grandchildren and children, and yet murdered, one of many, over 60,000 children killed that way. Now, Natives aren't citizens under the law in Canada. They're wards of the state. They're like a child under the law, which means you can kill them and there's no legal consequence. And that's handy in terms of grabbing their land and resources, but it's still that way under what's called the Indian Act, which is an illegal law. You're not allowed to have race-targeted legislation, right? Because it's discriminatory, for one thing. But Canada's allowed to do it, right? So, I mean, it's one of many crimes that go on legally, right? But anyway, getting back to my story, I began to learn these things, and I got threatened, and Anne was beginning to kind of look a lot scared and distance herself, but she wouldn't talk about it. She unfortunately had her own background of abuse, and it began. She went to a counselor over this stuff, and he began to leak to the church confidential things she had told him in counseling sessions.
No.
Yeah, and the church knew how to press her buttons, right? And that happened later, right? But at the time, I just didn't know what was going on. But I figured what you need to hear from the people themselves. So I opened the doors, opened the pews. I had an open pulpit policy. So anyone who wanted to comment after or say their own thing could get up at the pulpit. And Native people love that because they're from an oral culture, and they have speakers, and they're used to talking. They're used to telling their stories. So we began to hear it. Natives began to share what had happened. Now, some of the older white people freaked out and left, okay, because they had been part of the system. They had had friends. That a woman called Joan, her father had been this Alfred Caldwell who had murdered a little girl called Maisie Shaw. It's the first story about a murder ever to reach the media in Canada, but I'll get to that. But it shows the older people in the church were scared of this, but a lot of people heard about it and began to come in, including Natives, younger people, and we blossomed for 2 years. But what happened was that, and what was the nail in the coffin for me, the church could tolerate that because they were, at the same time as the Native people were talking about these things, there were no lawsuits being brought in. There was no consequence from what they were saying. And so the other people in the church thought, okay, this is good. Our church is growing. This is, so they could tolerate me. But I found out that there was a missionary who had grabbed a lot of the Native land. And then, so the church had a lot of stolen Native land, like all the churches did. And years ago, there was the biggest logging company in the world is called Weyerhaeuser. It's it's an American multinational based in Seattle. They had bought up the biggest logging company in British Columbia for $2.5 billion, Macmillan Bloedel. But they did it because they had got all this free land from the churches whose missionaries had grabbed all this native land. And I found out about this, and I said, hold the horses here, people. Our church policy says if we have native land that's been stolen, we are to return it to the native people without cost. Just return the stolen land. So I just quoted church policy, and I thought they would go, okay, fine. In fact, the minute I wrote that letter in October 1994, my fate was sealed, because the letter was instantly sent to the national office, to the provincial government, which was the biggest shareholder in this logging company. Suddenly I had all these enemies: the church, the logging company, the government, and all these people guilty of killing the Ahousa children. This was the Ahousa people on the West Coast, who half of whose children never came back from these death camps. So suddenly this all converged, and I got fired soon after that without cause. Two guys came in, handed me the letter. They made sure Anne was there. They called us both down to my church office and made sure they traumatized her as much as possible, because they knew she was the weak link. And it was so evil to watch this thing play out. But they said I was fired immediately. I was about to be expelled as a minister, so I could never have my livelihood would be stripped from me. But only if I agreed to pastoral retraining for a year without pay, which was absurd because I couldn't afford it. And I had to agree to psychiatric evaluation, right? Because that way I could paint myself as crazy, and everything I did would be delegitimated, and they could say, oh, look, all those stories about the Native people, he just made up. So a way to kind of set me up to take down the whole issue. I refused, and so we lost everything. We had to move out of the church manse where we lived, move back to Vancouver. I enrolled at the University of British Columbia to get a PhD in Native Studies. That was sabotaged after a year by the church, which I can describe. But they also went to Anne, and they were working with her to plan the divorce. And sure enough, that Christmas, right at Christmas Eve, for maximum impact, she told me she was leaving me. She took off in the middle of the night with both my daughters. I didn't know where they were for 3 days, just vanished. Process server comes to the door, bang, served, divorce papers, just bang, bang, bang. All these affidavits from people who I thought were friends saying what a terrible man and father I was. It was so arranged. It turned out that it cost the church several $1 million to do all this stuff. But they had a lot to lose, because I was the first person to ever talk about these crimes. Not just the dead children, but the land deals, land theft going on, big money involved, right? And so that was the end of that phase, and the beginning of my next phase, which was once I got treated like that, a lot of the Native people saw that I was someone to trust. I mean, they trusted me before because of my manner, and I wasn't pushing religion and everything, but they saw that I was going up against my own people. And then I began to get approached by people in Vancouver. That's when our movement began. And it started with this woman, Harriet Nahani, that woman right there. She was a survivor of the Alberni school. She saw the murder of that little girl, Maisie Shaw, who was kicked to her death by this Alfred Caldwell, the principal. I was having a picket. I protested at the United Church office about my unlawful firing. She heard about it. Harriet comes down to the protest. This is in December 1995. And she speaks to the Vancouver Sun reporters who are covering it. And she said, I saw a little girl killed, Maisie Shaw, kicked to her death. Made the headlines, boom. That started the whole issue. The lawsuits began after that, the first lawsuits against the residential schools. We started the first campaign of educational conferences. We held the first tribunal in 1998 that documented these crimes. We began protests at the churches. We created a total stink across the country. We were the first people ever to talk about it. Of course, you'll never hear about any of that now. My memory and all of this is being totally erased from the internet, from the official memory. But one thing led to another, and that's really how our movement began.
How did you keep going? Why did you keep going when you had all that against you? What was it in you? A lot of people, I would say, the majority of people would have given up right away at the first threat.
I think it was something in me that was activated by this. It's about character, what's within us, and you need often suffering and repression to bring out that quality of you. And it did in me, for sure. Also, I was angry as hell. I thought, what have I done wrong here? I was just pointing out something that's true. I was angry about how my children had been stolen from me. And I wanted to be able to face them one day and say, look, I did the right thing. I'm not going to go along with people who are hiding the murder of their children, of innocent children, generations of them, right? So it was all that. Plus, I took courage from the people I was working with, Native people who had been through horrible tortures were somehow hanging on every day. I thought if they can risk their lives, then I can too, right? And so we strengthened each other. It wasn't just personal attributes. It was like taking strength from each other, you know. And, I think echoes of my ancestors who had been through similar persecutions from the church over the centuries and that. So that all happened, that all came to bear. And, one thing just kept leading to another, right?
Before we move on to sort of the next phase of your story and sort of where this started taking you, could you define genocide in your own words and also maybe explain a little bit more the legal processes that have been put in place that allow this? I think it's going to shock people because I think that's something people,
Yeah.
just aren't aware of. And I think it's more than just Canada. Like that's
Yeah.
we always hear how, Indians and these different cultures peacefully gave people their land, and the story's so much more sinister than that. But it is like it's really like written in laws and,
Yeah.
they've been getting away with this for a long time all over the world.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it began centuries ago, really from the Vatican, where they basically said anyone who isn't a Catholic doesn't have the right to their land or their own life. Well, my Annett is a French name. We were Huguenot Protestants in France, and we were burned out of there in the 1500s. Queen Elizabeth I gave us sanctuary in England, so we all moved over there. Right? But so it's a personal issue for us too. We've been struck by this same genocide, but the word means to kill a group. Genus or gens in Greek means a people. Side is to kill a group. And the term was invented by a guy called Raphael Lemkin. He worked for the U.S. War Department, a lawyer, and during World War II. And over 50 members of his family had been slaughtered in Auschwitz. He was a Polish Jew. And he developed the word because the United Nations after World War II wanted to develop laws preventing another mass genocide that had happened during World War II. But unfortunately for the people and the law, government politics came to play. So the United States and Canada looked at Lemkin's definition of genocide. It means any destruction of any group. And it means not just physical killing, but if you're stopping them from speaking their language, that's cultural genocide. If you're sterilizing them so they can't have kids, that's biological. Physical, when you line them up and shoot them all. But America and Canada and Britain got together and said, okay, that can indict us for what we're doing to Native people. So we're going to modify the definition. So they de-emphasized cultural and biological and just talked about physical genocide. And that's all you ever hear about now. Oh yeah, the genocide is when somebody shoots somebody and tries to wipe them out. But he had a much broader definition. They changed all that, and they made it difficult for any nation to enact that. It was the Genocide Convention was passed in 1948 after much editing at the UN, but it doesn't apply to any country unless they brought in what's called enabling legislation, so it could be applied to the laws of their own country, sovereign nation, right? So Canada didn't do that until the year 2000, right? So anything before 2000 couldn't be prosecuted for genocide. So naturally that covered the whole residential school era. So governments around the world have ways of circumventing this all the time. And, the grotesque example of this is both the Pope, Francis, and Jorge Bergoglio, and Justin Trudeau, who is former prime minister, they both said a few years ago, oh, yes, it was genocide. Well, under international law, then they should have been prosecuted for crimes against humanity. But they can say it and nothing ever happens. There's no consequence. Only 2 times in history has the Genocide Convention ever been used in an international criminal court. And that's against Rwanda and Serbia. Milosevic in Serbia and the Rwandan genocide between the Hutu and the Tutsi tribes, right? Both those countries kind of marginal, not close to the Western power, so they can afford to, persecute them or prosecute them, but it's never been applied to any of the major genocidal powers, including the Vatican, which is one of the biggest ones in history. So that's kind of a background to genocide. People use the word cheaply now, without really understanding what it means. And, anyway, we can get more into that, but that's kind of some of the background.
And I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, and I agree. I think a lot of our language over time has been distorted and manipulated, to where the definitions are twisted just a little bit to sort of, mean one thing, but it leaves out the
Yeah,
entire categorical definition of what it was and what it all encompasses, and so I just wanted you to share that,
yeah,
because I think a lot of people have in their mind, like you said, that genocide is just people physically going in, lining up a bunch of people, and then erasing them essentially, physically with weapons or, in a gas chamber. I think,
yeah,
but like you said, there's the generational aspect, and it's cultures over time that this is being, perpetuated on, which is really scary. And so after you went through all of these different threats, you have pretty much your whole life, just like a rug just taken out, from underneath your feet. What was next for you with your journey in pursuing all of this?
Well, what happened very soon after I lost my children? So Anne won her case in divorce court. Naturally, the church paid her over $38,000 for
Oh,
her lawyer. That all came out later.
oh,
They spent over $50,000 throwing me out. It was a public defrocking, and you see, it all happened at the same time. The divorce court, my expulsion from the church, taking away my livelihood. I was living out of my car, literally. All that happened in the same year. Bang, bang, bang. Just double punch. And so I only saw Claire and Eleanor twice during the week, and that was the difficult thing. That was the most painful, heart ripping part of that whole thing. To see what it was doing to them, and to try to explain to them. I mean, they were only 7 and 4 and years old, and how do you explain to them at that young age? And so I naturally didn't share a lot with them, which was, in a way, in hindsight, too bad, because their mom was telling them all the time what a terrible man your father was and why he lost his job. And that contributed to some of the estrangement. I mean, later when they were older women, they understood better, but they still have that, children of divorce tend to do that. They don't want to think bad about mom, so let's not look at that dad's talking about and all that. So it was really horrible. But it helped in a way, because I'd go to the healing circles. These are survivors of these death camps. And we began to organize the first of them, Harriet Nahani and I. And they saw that I was suffering and bleeding myself. I wasn't there as the white guy to fix everything, right? As a professional helper. I was suffering with them. We had kind of a commonality of pain. And out of that, we were able to act together. And we said, look, we got to do more than therapy circles. We've got to confront this crime. So that's why we held the tribunal. We invited in a UN group called IRAM to do in June 1998. IHRAAM. It stands for the International Human Rights Association of American Minorities. So its mandate was to look at human rights abuses against Indigenous people. And they showed up, they sponsored it, they paid for the hall. Later, they said they didn't. There was a big cover-up where they pretended they never had anything to do with it later when the government got to them. But anyway, at the time, 12 judges showed up. They're all Indigenous elders. And they heard 3 days of testimony. For the first time, everything defined as genocide. When we talked earlier about genocide, the UN Convention defines 5 things as genocide. Not just killing a group, but taking the children away, creating long-term conditions where the group is going to die off, all of that stuff. All 5 of those we proved at that tribunal weekend that had occurred in the Rose schools. And people were getting up and describing for the first time being sterilized, being held under x-ray machines. You see, if you didn't go to church, you'd get a red tag. If you spoke your language, you'd get a red tag. If you married outside the reservation to a traditional man or woman, red tag. Red tag people had to go and either had tubal ligations as a woman, castration in some cases with men, but often under the x-ray machines, like in Auschwitz. to sterilize people. I talked to a group of Kenny Quatel and his 4 brothers from Cowboy River. All of them sterilized, never had any kids. Seriously burned down there as well in the X-ray machines.
Oh,
All of
wow.
that going on, and the child trafficking going on still from the reservations. People are talking about all this stuff. So these horrified judges wrote to the UN and said right away, Canada's got to be investigated and prosecuted for these things. A woman called Denise Frechette, she worked for the Canadian government. She intervened and made sure that Mary Robinson, who was Human Rights Commissioner then, made sure she didn't act on it. So it was just shut right down. The Globe and Mail newspaper reported it briefly, but then nothing. You didn't hear about it. And what happened was a counterattack. The RCMP began targeting people who had given testimonies. And in fact, this was a whole operation. The Jean Chrétien government authorized the attacks. It was really a black ops operation against everything we're beginning to do, led by a guy called Peter Montague. He was a black operative for the RCMP in Vancouver. He began to organize things like the internet smears on me. Don't believe Kevin Annett. He's got a grudge against the church. Like all of these, what you do, you create a fog and you smear the person. And more seriously, among the native eyewitnesses, they began disappearing. And in fact, 7 of our eyewitnesses, 7 of our activists in our group in Vancouver all died. They're all native, like Harriet, who began the campaign. She and I started it in 1998. This is her being arrested in the year 2007. There was a protest in Vancouver to stop the construction of a highway through the reservation. And she was arrested by these 2 Mounties, taken before a judge in Vancouver, who immediately assigned her to what's called Surrey Remand, which is a prison, put in an unheated cell at age 72. She came out and was dead within 48 hours of, quote, lung cancer, right? She had been in St. Paul's Hospital, which is a Catholic hospital in Vancouver, notorious, where people go in and never come out again if you're native or, that's a whole other story I could talk about. But so our people began to die off. And at that point, I realized, okay, we got to go international with this for our own safety, right? So I began to get coverage in international papers, magazines. The New Internationals magazine in England was the first. And in response to this, the government starts its buy-off campaign. They set up something called the Aboriginal Healing Fund. And if you're a survivor of these places, you could get money in compensation, but only if you sign off all legal action and indemnify the churches, which means you have to say they didn't do anything wrong. They're not guilty of anything in return for this blood money. And you have to sign off for your children. So it's a way to just cover up the whole thing again. Gag order, the usual bit, right? And most of the people we work with didn't go for it. They were disgusted. But the chiefs, these are the government-funded chiefs, who often were, when they were children in these death camps, they were the collaborators. They would rat out the other children, and then they would be good. They didn't get raped as often. They got a better education. They became the tribal council government-funded chiefs. They got on board and say, yeah, everybody should accept this money. We want healing. We don't hold anything against these churches. It was disgusting to watch, and it still goes on. They call it healing and reconciliation, but it's just the usual cover-up and denial. So that started. It shows we're having an impact, because every time we did something, the government would respond within a few months, but not make it look like it was just their idea, not because of anything we were doing. So that led to eventually we started this thing called the Friends and Relatives of the Disappeared. And we had groups all over Canada. We began to hold protests and even sit-ins at churches on Sundays. And that began to get their attention too. And eventually that led to their official apology, which now an apology under the law is not what it sounds like. The word apology, you can look it up in the dictionary. An apologetic is not to say you're sorry, it's to defend something, to defend the action or the word. Like an apologetic in literature, you're defending some writer or some position, right? Apology means under the law, you'll notice they never say I'm sorry when a government leader apologizes. They don't apologize. They don't say I'm sorry. They say we issue an apology for this. That means under the law, we're indemnifying ourselves We're not liable. We didn't do anything. But it's creating the impression, with English words can do this. You can have double meanings, right? Contradictory meanings. They create the impression among everyone that, oh, they're sorry, now things are going to be better. When in fact it was worse, because when they issued this money to people, you couldn't get more than $10,000 top. If you've had your life destroyed, seen your family members killed and everything, you got 10,000. But you had to not only indemnify yourself, but help the cover up. You had to, anyone who was involved in our campaign never got the money. They were isolated in that. And the survivors who got the money were expected to help point out where these mass graves were. And the RCMP would then go in and dig them all up. And that's why when you hear now people saying, oh, they're in our graves, well, that's because most of them have been dug up and destroyed by the Mounties, or the children were incinerated. They often just threw the bodies in the school furnaces. And there were a lot of them. You know, one principal in Brantford in 1948 said, we've had to bury children 2 and 3 to a grave. You know, we have all these documents. And so that shut down our campaign in Canada. But right at the same time, I got an invitation. This was in 2008. You know, in South African apartheid, if you were banned, your name was never allowed to be mentioned in the paper. You couldn't meet with more than 2 people at a time. That's what happened to me. I got banned in Canada. I was never referred to again in the press. The harassment increased, just really bad stuff. But right at the same time, I get invited over to Ireland in 2009 by a group of survivors of the same crimes in the Catholic Church. And that's where we set up the tribunal and what eventually became the Commonwealth Court that forced Ratzinger out. We realized we're up against an international corporation, the oldest one in the world, called the Catholic Church. And we started this International Tribunal. And that's another big picture, piece of the picture that started right at that point.
As you were going more global, I know you said you obviously went to Ireland for this, and I'd love to hear more about that. Did you start getting survivors from other cultures and countries as well that were coming forward and saying, oh, this is happening here too?
Oh, yeah. One of the first groups was Mayan Indians in Guatemala. They actually sent, it's called a denuncia. It's a petition demanding that Canada be charged with genocide. That happened right at the same time as we were doing our church occupations and that. And not only that, I mean, I probably got easily a dozen countries of people writing in. People in northern Scandinavia, the Sami people, indigenous people in Greenland, saying, yeah, they put us in camps. They were killing off half the children. It's like the same crime all over the world. And the Catholic Church is always there doing it, along with government compliance. So, you know, they were the common criminal in this whole thing, the Church of Rome. And it gave us an advantage because we had allies in every country to do this. It wasn't just Canada. It suddenly blossomed all over the world, and we were hearing from people all over. Incredible stuff, and it really kind of expanded our awareness of really the tiger whose tail we had grabbed, right?
Oh my gosh. Wow, that had to have been really overwhelming for you too, just especially because you're being so persecuted in your own country, and now you're seeing a big picture that, wow, you know, this I discovered here in Canada, but it's also here in Ireland, it's also here, and
Yeah,
it's here. And look at all these different survivors and all these
yeah,
different countries that have been going through this, you know, for God knows how long, and just these
yeah,
consistent, deliberate, systemic cover-ups.
right. Systemic is the word for it because it's built right in. So, you know, at that point, I realized it's funny how one door closes, another opens, right? There's a real hidden-handed work. And one of the things that happened, which was right at the same time as we set up the tribunal, I got invited to Rome by people who wanted to hear about, you know, indigenous. It's kind of a fad in Germany and Italy about Native people in North America, and so they're interested in that. So I went to Rome. I spoke in Genoa and around northern Italy, and then to Rome. And I'm there in Rome, and I'm thinking, hold on, we're right here in the heart of the beast. I can't pass this up. And I had brought with me soil from the graves of children who died at these Catholic death camps. And I said, okay, let's do a ceremony for them right here in St. Peter's Square. And then I realized, you know what? It is not just a ceremony for the dead. It should be an exorcism. We should call out this spirit, this deadly spirit in Rome. And I did that, and it was the weirdest thing, Emma. Um, this is October 11th, 2009, and I had a few supporters there with me, but you can't hold any kind of ceremony or protest in St. Peter's Square. The Rome and the Vatican police grab you. They had just done that to a group of 13 native grandmothers who had tried to hold that, and they were arrested for holding a pagan ceremony in St. Peter's Square, right? Those were the charges against them. So I thought, I didn't even know that. I just walked right in the middle of St. Peter's Square. I had my robes on, my regalia. I started calling out. I did this because I've taken part in Exorcism previously, which is a story in itself. But I just called out the entity Rome, called it to name itself, which is the first stage in an exorcism. When the entity names itself, it loses its power. And so, anyway, I did that. The next morning, 8 a.m., downtown Rome gets hit by a tornado, first one in 48 years.
Wow.
And even more significant, 2 days later, the European press started reporting for the first time Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger at the time, his role in ordering bishops all over Europe to conceal child trafficking and deaths and rape and all that stuff. It hit the press for the first time. So I realized, okay, I'm at the center of the storm here, and I don't even really understand it, but it's working through me. So I said, let's keep going. And I think it's given me the protection I've had as well, because when you're doing that, you are protected. I know that. And not only because I was a public figure and they would look really bad if they knocked me off, it would bring too much attention to what I was saying, right? Like, hey, maybe this guy's onto something. Look what they did to him, right? But this unseen, force that does protect people doing the right thing. And so that was quite an eye opener too when that happened.
Oh gosh, I bet. It gives me chills just hearing about it. I can't
Mm.
even imagine how that must have been a pretty neat moment for you, like very validating.
Oh, it's incredible. And when I came back to Vancouver and I met with some of the native elders, they all heard about it and they said, wow, Kevin, this is fantastic. It gave everyone such a boost to know that we had done that. And I tried to show that as an example to people, but you shouldn't ever be afraid when you're doing the right thing, because what's in here can't be killed. The truth can't be killed. Our spirit, once it overcomes those natural fears we have as human beings, right? You're unbeatable. What can they do, right? If you've overcome the fear of death, what are they going to do? You know. So I mean, I learned that, and that was another gift given me.
And that eventually led to a resignation. Could you talk just a little bit about kind of leading up to that with Pope Benedict?
Yeah. Well, what we
Pretty
did
big
was,
deal.
oh yeah, it. So 2012, um, in July, the tribunal, under international law, citizens can form their own investigative bodies, including their own courts. If the courts and government are compromised, if they're part of a crime, the people can convene their own. Like in America, they call it the grand jury system, where they have 25, 30 citizens who can decide for themselves whether criminal charges can be laid. Um, and they don't have that in most countries. America is unique in that way. But international law says, yeah, you can form what's called a tribunal of conscience. And we did that. We formed a common law court with judges. We had a former Spanish judge, Bartolomeo, what was his name? I'll remember it. It'll come back to me. But anyway, he had been booted out of the Spanish courts for trying to take on the Catholic Church for their trafficking of children during the Franco dictatorship. Um, so anyway, we convened this court, issued summonses against Ratzinger. We used all of the evidence from all of our work over all those years in Canada and around the world, brought it together. We indicted 30 people. I call them the Dirty 30, including Queen Elizabeth, who had taken, this is a side story I'll tell you briefly about. She had been seen taking 10 children out of the Kamloops Catholic School in 1964 by an eyewitness, William Coombs, who subsequently was killed for it in St. Paul's Hospital just before he was to give testimony about it. William, you might have heard about, he made a lot of exposure on the internet all over this, but so she was indicted as a co-conspirator in having personal responsibility for having kidnapped 10 children from this place, and they were never seen again. We summoned her, we summoned Ratzinger, we summoned all of them. They refused. Now, under law, when you do not contest something said about you, it's a tacit admission of guilt. You're not challenging it, you know. And by doing that, they condemn. Normally, in a court of law, you can an immediate guilty verdict can be issued if somebody's not going to plead, right? But we proceeded anyway because we wanted to show the evidence of all of this. And the trial went on almost 6 months, and finally, over 6 months actually, we brought in lots of evidence. And what we also did is we showed that evidence to governments in Europe. And the Spanish government at the time had the right to try any human rights case within it had universal jurisdiction over human rights cases. We knew that. We went to them. We shared this information. And guess what? 6 days before Ratzinger resigns, their Secretary of State in Rome gets a diplomatic note from the Spanish government saying if Ratzinger comes to Spain, he might be arrested for what we've seen. And 6 days later, he resigns, February 11th, 2013. 2 weeks later, the verdict comes down of guilty. That's no coincidence because 3 other people we indicted, 3 other cardinals, including the head of the Jesuits, they all stepped down over the next few months after that. And they were found guilty of crimes against humanity, sentenced to life imprisonment in absentia, and we put out universal arrest warrants against them. That's why Ratzinger stayed in the Vatican until the day he died, because he knew he could be arrested by citizens, by police, anywhere for doing that. And they just hide behind this shield of the church and the way the governments collude with the church for protection. But they had been found guilty. And that created an enormous shot heard around the world. Within a few years after that, this common law movement began where people were learning about common law, doing training about it, forming their own courts. We triggered yet another kind of revolution in the way people were thinking that you can put anyone on trial, including these guilty heads of state and church, right? So that was an enormous breakthrough as well.
Wow. That's amazing that, that you and others were able to make that happen and to, take it up to that level, especially starting so local where you were, on a much smaller scale, genocide is big no matter what, but starting in one country in one area and then
Right.
eventually, sort of taking that leap of faith in Rome and then going all the way up to the top, that had to have been so just incredible for you. And I'm sure that they didn't give you enough credit for that, as that story was going, and I'm sure it was pretty buried.
Well, not only didn't give credit, but they ramped up the smear campaign, making it look like other people had brought this out, and Kevin Annett has been, kind of an opportunist taking advantage. They totally rewrite history.
Man.
Because if they really told my story, all of this stuff would be exposed. The whole culture is delegitimated, church and state, big money, the 3 main agents of genocide over the centuries. They were all on the line as well over this. They were in the docket. And so you can't remember someone like me because it indicts the whole system. And that scares people on the ground too, because it's one thing to say, okay, this priest hurt this child, fine. But when you say, no, there's a policy, which there is in the Catholic Church, called Crimen Solicitatis. It's been around since 1929. It says when children are raped, no one is to be told. Police are not to be told. That's a criminal conspiracy to protect a child rapist. Every Catholic in the world is obligated to enforce that. So you're indicting the whole system there. And I guess it's too much for a lot of people who don't feel the pain, who haven't, when you be through the fire, a lot of fears fall away, and you see that it's like my dad. My dad's American. He's 97, living down in Florida. And he was in the Korean War. And he said most of his regiment got wiped out when the Chinese invaded, just kind of almost pushed the U.S. Army into the sea. And Dad calls it the big bug out, like they all just took off. But he said, when they're under fire, when you're a raw recruit, the first thing you do is you hide, because you're protecting yourself. It's a self-preservation instinct. But when you see your friend killed or when you're facing imminent destruction, it's like Sun Tzu says in The Art of War, never force anyone to a corner, because then they find their true resolve. They know they're going to die. They have to fight back, and they lose their fear. And Dad said after that, all they thought about was how to keep moving forward. I'm worried about the bullet that's going to hit me. I've got to keep going. I've got to keep moving forward and protect my buddies. That kind of warrior instinct is what took over in us. And that's why Native people like William, they knew that they had everything to lose. Under law, they weren't protected. They knew and that's what happened to 7 of them in Vancouver alone. They were all killed, poisoned in the hospital, died in police custody, hit by a car. I mean, it was all different things, but they knew they were going to die from taking that stand, but they did anyway. And when you talk about heroes, Like they say, the heroes are the ones who didn't come back, the real ones. And they keep me going every day. And, their spirit lives on. Right?
And with society too, it seems like with these different crimes against humanity, especially when it comes to children, I think the perception is this doesn't happen around me. This happens in the slums and third world
Right.
countries. I don't have to worry about it because it's not in my direct circle. This doesn't affect me,
Right.
and nothing could be further from the truth. Whenever you really dig into a lot of this, you see how not just common it is,
Yeah.
but that it's in our communities. It is happening locally and everywhere, in the world, there's these different crimes that are happening, especially when it pertains to children. And of course, children can't speak up and they have no advocate,
No.
and most of them that do speak up are older, they've had to overcome a lot in order to even get the courage to speak up. And then they're abused all over again, just like how you witnessed and, that you continue to witness.
Well, and that's the thing, Emma. Like what we focused on more and more now, and a lot of the work we do is about how it's carrying on today. And child trafficking and all of the torture and murder that's associated with it is very much operating right in the system now. It's not some crazies out there. There's a whole network within the social work, legal system, among the police and everything that traffic children. And especially through the churches who are basically outside the law and cooperate as their own law. But right in the government system, like for every honest person, there's another one doing this, and they're camouflaged by the system. And that's why it's so insidious. Human trafficking is a huge global industry now. It's like a new slave trade. And we've got more and more evidence of that, and it's all connected. It's like the same beast touching different aspects of it, right?
Absolutely. And in the Indigenous communities that were being genocided and erased, what examples of human trafficking did you find and sort of like where was that hiding in there?
Well, in the past, just it was all institutionalized.
Yeah.
When they phased out the so-called residential schools in the 70s, they turned it over to the local tribal council to run. But a lot of these tribal council chiefs were themselves perpetrators because it happened to them. I didn't know one Native family in Port Alberni who weren't doing that to one another. It's insidious in the culture. And these chiefs get to power because the government has dirt on them. They can control them to sign away the land and the resources to China and to other companies, right? Other countries that are grabbing the oil and gas now in Canada. The chiefs make a lot of money trafficking drugs and children. I worked in a lot of reserves, and they're like fortresses, though, where one or two families run everything, and they can throw people out of their homes and jobs. It's like a little dictatorship, and the government likes it that way because they keep the Indigenous population down. Their own people do, right? But today, that's how it happens. And I should have mentioned that murderbydecree.com, a lot of the evidence is right there online if people want to read it, if they're doubting. We have a DVD set based on all that evidence. This is 3 DVDs and our documentary film, which I'll mail to you, by the way. And it documents everything. It's what we presented to the International Common Law Court of Justice. All the evidence we presented to the court that convicted all those people, Ratzinger and the Queen and everybody, it's all on here. And when people are always saying, where's the proof? I say, well, just take the time to watch these eyewitness testimonies, corroborated by documents, corroborated by forensic evidence. That's all you need in a court of law, right? That's the website. Yeah. You can also order my books on there. You got a link to the books and to my radio show and all that on that.
Could you talk a little bit about a couple of your books? I know you have so many, so it'd probably take, I'm sure we can talk about all of them as our podcasts are ongoing, but maybe talk about this one and
Yeah. This was kind of the foundational book based on evidence over the previous 20 years. We published that in 2016 because the government set up a big spin operation called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And if you can believe this, it was set up by the government and churches themselves. It's like a serial killer investigating, appointing the judge and jury. And the government said to the churches, you can censor all of the evidence you want out of your own archives. You don't have to share it. This commission has no power to subpoena. You can't lay criminal charges. You're not allowed to name names if you're a Native person. Now, it was a complete whitewash, and yet the world presented it like a serious investigation. As a matter of fact, when they finally issued their report in 2015, even the New York Times said, oh, Canada documents its genocide. It did nothing of the sort. In fact, it was used as a way to suppress any truth. It didn't allow, and I went to some of their conferences, it was disgusting to watch. They gave, if you were a Native person, you wanted to talk about what happened to you in one of these places, you had to give your statement to the judges. All three judges appointed by the churches and the Canadian government, the perpetrators. And the judges would look through the statement and take out anything they didn't like. And then they would own it legally. They would own your statement. And recently, the courts in Canada ruled that all that could be destroyed. All the crime scene evidence could be destroyed, going against what they had promised at the time, which is they would release it eventually, right? And yet, you're given 10 minutes to talk. And after that, your mic would be turned off if you kept going on. If you mentioned, for example, which was common, if you said, this person raped me, or I saw this child get buried here, boom, mic would be turned off, just censored. It was an exercise in huge censorship. But then they allow a Catholic bishop to stand up at the mic for half an hour and go on about how they were trying to just help these poor children, right? Just lies. It was a forum for institutionalized cover-up and creating a false narrative. That's the whole point of this. In the next generation, you're going to create a false narrative. So now, all you hear about is, yeah, some children were harmed. It's unfortunate. You don't hear about the 60,000 children who we documented being killed, and probably more, from their own statistics showing, going back as far as 1903, showing half the children were dying because they were taking the healthy and sticking them in with the sick and letting them die. That was Dr. Peter Bryce of the health department documented that in 1907, that was the way they were depopulating the Native population. That's genocide right there. Yet none of that in the official narrative now. So that TRC that they set up for 7 years, $128 million to create the huge false account and suppress the lingering evidence of genocide, actual genocide from the survivors. So, that's how it works.
Now, what kind of money are we looking at that these governments are profiting from this historically, and obviously continually to this day?
Oh, huge amount. I mean, Canada especially, it's a huge resource for various empires over the centuries. France, then England, then America, now China. In 1 year, Canada produces somewhere around $8.5 trillion in wealth. Most of that is resources being pumped out of the country, oil and gas. China, which is one of the main owners of the Canadian economy. As a matter of fact, China is a bigger trading partner now with Canada than America is. And China is switching from coal to liquid natural gas. And most of the LNG in the world is right up there in Alberta and British Columbia and the Northwest Territories. And so companies like PetroChina and Sinopec go in there, set up these camps outside Canadian jurisdiction. The Trudeau government passed a law, Foreign Investment Protection Act, which allows China to buy up the whole country and even station its own troops on Canadian soil. And they run these camps. They bring in Native women a lot to be used, prostitutes for the camp workers. A lot of these women disappear. It's like you can't go into areas of northern Canada at all. It's just blocked off by the military. Where the uranium, a lot of the uranium for depleted uranium weapons in the States and that's all coming from Native land, which are run, it's like military occupation with Chinese troops there doing it now. And that's all being authorized by both the Liberal and Conservative governments in Canada. So this is what we mean by ongoing genocide, right?
How horrifying.
Very lucrative.
Yeah. And like you said, it's an incredible moneymaker for, Canada is just one country, but I mean, we hear about how the United States profits from crimes against children, which also leads to genocide because, people speak out or things happen and, people just disappear, So you see how this is, like you said, a systemic issue globally that's literally built into society because it is so profitable. You look at like the drug industry and people probably think, well, why would this be so big? Like, why are children so profitable? profitable, and it's like, well, a drug you use one time, a child, unfortunately, and so sadly and horrifically, can have a whole lifespan,
Right.
of being a child, being a teenager, even into adulthood, and into, through perpetrating, then becoming the perpetrator and passing it down to their own kids. And you see the genius, the disgusting genius in creating these sort of generational patterns within these families because then it stays in the family. It's not random kids now that they have to go kidnap, that all of a sudden then you have families saying, my kid's gone, my kid's gone. It stays in the family, it stays secret, it gets passed down and it's compartmentalized. So it's pretty much invisible to society.
Right. And you hit it right on the head. I mean, the way this works, very lucrative. And also, if you're a ruler, the best way to keep people in line is to traumatize them at a young age. That's why child rape is not really a crime under the law. In Catholic doctrine, it's not a crime at all. It's called a sin. Raping a child is a sin, not a crime. And a sin can be forgiven. Because don't forget, they believe children are born evil, thanks to the original sin doctrine. And they're only saved by the sacraments of the Church of Rome. And you can do anything to the child to get them in line. Like Thomas Aquinas, the church philosopher back in the Middle Ages, said, kill the body to save the soul. I mean, that's the attitude, right? In Canada, they just lowered the mandatory sentencing for child rape down to 6 months. That's how much time you get in jail for raping a child. Less than owning a marijuana plant, right? So, I mean, in practice, like genocide, harming children is a tool of church and state. And it's not in practice a crime. I've heard this from cops. I mean, a cop, I gave a talk in New York City once, and a retired policeman came and said, we never investigate child rape cases unless it's happened 10 or 20 times. That's just kind of the unwritten rule. Because we can't get a conviction. Because that's how they base everything on, whether they can convict the guy or not, whether to bring a case. And, a child getting raped, that's not such a bad thing. If somebody does it a lot, well, they always do it a lot, because these are serial actions. As you know, it's part of a whole trafficking ring. And churches provide the best cover for that, right?
Absolutely. And so how do we change this through your work, through your advocacy? What do we have to do as a society to stop this, to prevent it from happening, to expose it?
Well, we've already showed ways, through direct action, confronting them. The smaller you are, the louder you have to be.
Yeah.
Confront them on what any institution has two Achilles heels: money, public image. And we threatened both when we started these church occupations, right? And that kind of direct action helps make it a public issue. But in this climate of mass censorship and corporate control of the media, that's very hard to do, to get the word out. So you got to act locally and link up in our kind of alternative network, which is global now, in bringing in real alternatives. And that's why the power of these common law courts. We can issue our own arrest warrants. We can issue our own laws. You mentioned the Republic of Canada, which is something that came out of all this. In 2015, this was formed as a sovereign nation, 221 delegates in Winnipeg. A third of them were Native. And you see, the Queen of England was convicted in that same case of Ratzinger in 2013, the common law court. And so the Canada didn't have an official head of state. She was a convicted felon. That created an opening for us to declare, okay, we're going to do like America and Ireland and all these other countries did, and sever ties with the British Crown. You take an oath of allegiance to Canada, and you're no longer part of the Commonwealth. All of these oaths to the Crown are nullified. And we create our own republic from the grassroots. We formed common law assemblies, republic assemblies and courts that passed their own laws. We passed laws doing things like negating federal taxes, reclaiming so-called crown land. In some of the COVID measures, we nullified them because they were unwarranted and unhealthy. And we were never stopped by the police, never arrested, because they know we're operating out of our own sovereign jurisdiction. And that's how we change things. You create your own balloon and you deflate the balloon of the system as you inflate your own. You don't attack a dying system. It just sucks your energy. You create your own terrain. Like Sun Tzu, again, in The Art of War, he said, whoever sets the terms of battle, he calls it controlling the ground, wins. you win the battle because you've set the conditions of the battle. You define the issue. Like many years passed, and we were the only ones using the word genocide. Now everybody's using it. They had to come over to that understanding, right? Those words, because we just kept saying it over and over because it was true. And it's true. Whatever you do, you establish your ground, and something new starts. And it's incredibly empowering. You don't have to wait for politicians or any of that. You can start creating your own. And I think in the long run, that's got to be our, answer, because not just about genocide and what happens to children, but all of these threats to Mother Earth and to ourselves and our liberties, they're all under attack now by this thing we like to call the corporatocracy. It's bigger than governments, corporate conglomerates that run the world now, and human beings are expendable in that, as we've seen, right? And that's the omnicide now, not just genocide against group, omnicide against everybody that we're facing. I think that's one of the bigger things that we've learned out of this, right?
And few people have done as much work as you have in creating an ecosystem for change. And I wanted to give you an opportunity before we start closing up today to talk about Unrepentant. I'd love to send people there to go watch it, to maybe talk about a little bit more about your books and where people can find
Yeah.
them. And of course, you do a radio show, and I wanted you to talk about that too. I'd love for people interested to tune into that and support you.
Okay, it's on that. It's called Radio Free Canada. It's bbsradio.com/Radio Free Canada. It's on tomorrow, first and third Sundays of the month at 12 noon Eastern and, wait a minute. No, not 12 noon. Negate that. 9 a.m. Eastern, 12 noon, 9 a.m. Pacific. Sorry, 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 noon Eastern time, on that channel that you see right there. And in the archive there, the show began actually when the Republic was set up. It's come on and off, depending on how much it's kind of repressed. It's been taken down a few times, but it's got, in the old shows, it's got a lot of important interviews about all of the stuff we've been talking about. And the websites you've got, I guess you'll post, murderbydecree.com, republicofcanada.org. And my books, there's actually, hold on. My books now number 28. And some of them are biographical. Some of them are on the genocide topic. Also, we do practical manuals. Common law training manual. It shows you how to set up common law courts. We did the Republic of Canada book describing the vision and the program of the Republic. This one came out recently, called Governing Ourselves, a handbook on personal, political, and spiritual sovereignty. This is really foundational as well about why we are born sovereign, how we exercise that, how no system of government, or religion, or anything binds us. We can separate and assert our own sovereignty at any point. That's kind of intrinsic to the notion in the original American Republic, that people govern themselves. They're not governed over by some, Thomas Paine in the American Revolution, he said, democracy doesn't consist of choosing your masters, but of having none. And I always remember that because it's kind of the philosophy of sovereignty in a nutshell. And those are some of the books. You can see a lot of them listed right there on murderbydecree.com. There's a link to a lot of the books. And some of them are very heartfelt. I did want to mention this too. Oh, this is sold 800 copies in the last month. This is all the evidence you need about Vatican crimes and what the Vatican is, how to take it on, dethroning a rogue power. And this one, I had an ancestor, Peter Annett. He lived in England in the 1700s. He was a free thinker, and he challenged, religion, but he took on the Church of England. He got thrown in jail and in the stocks when he was 70 years old for it. That's him, Peter Annett. And what's really amazing, Emma, his story and mine are really interwoven. And people keep saying, you got to be the reincarnation of this guy because he's taken on the same enemies. His character was the same. He never gave up to the day he died. He was in poverty and in jail, and he just never stopped. And so anyway, that's on a different sort of rock, it's called. So those are some of the books. But oh, Unrepentant as well. Send them the link. That was the movie. We're trying to do a sequel, but we just don't have the resources right now in that. But that came out in 2007. It's really what. Yeah, that's me with hair. Um, that was filmed in around 2005, 2006, and this is the film that triggered the whole exposure of genocide because some members of parliament saw it, got up and began to question about the residential school graves. And within a year, you had that whole, a quote apology and all that cover up that followed. But this really triggered it. It got like 250,000 hits in 1 month. It was known all over the country. And it was really foundational. And that's, again, a lot of it's been wiped out. I'd say 90% of what we've ever posted on the internet's now gone.
Like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, even the word, genocide in general just gets stripped off platforms like YouTube. So that's really great that you have, people and creators that are continuing to hopefully put up your videos and support you. Um, what have you seen as far as when you first started kind of speaking out on this to now? Are you seeing more awareness, more people caring about this? Is the response different than before?
It's been better and worse in ways. What's better is you learn information a lot quicker
Yes.
now. The technology is there to learn it, but the technology also censors at the same time. So it's the degree, it's shrinking down like that. There isn't the breadth of understanding anymore as we used to have. And so that's what happens when communication and knowledge gets put into one medium, you know. And in fact, I think that was part of a plan to do that deliberately. It's a way to control human thinking, to have it all in one source. So it's better in terms people have the knowledge, but then I say, okay, but having knowledge is just first step. Then you got to act on it. And people seem to be losing the ability to act. And I never like to sound pessimistic, although it's true that there are not a lot of people out there willing to go, okay, now let's go confront these crimes. Let's find out where the children are being, trafficked. Let's confront this local Catholic church because we know they're doing it. They're obligated to protect child rapists. Let's take it on and tell the local Catholics to leave the church, stop giving their money, form your own congregation, just get out of that institution, right? People willing to do that, I can count on one hand often, right? So, and that's even though we had like 350,000 viewers watching those Sean Atwood broadcasts, right? Hundreds of thousands of people know about this, and then you never hear from them. Or, so it's almost like people have become very passive, and I don't know the word for it, but that's got to change if we were to save ourselves, not alone children, but if we ever to have a future, that's got to change, right?
Well, we can't thank you enough for living by example, and I hope other people continue to hear your voice, even though I'm sure you're still being just actively censored, in as many ways as possible.
No.
I think when people see somebody doing it and they see a leader, then they want to follow. It's just we have sort of like a lack of leaders. I think people really do care and like they want to do something. It's so
Yeah.
overwhelming though. People are like, what do I do? Like I'm just one person, but you realize that you're not just one person. There's a lot of people who care. And I think a lot of the people that just sit there and don't do anything really do care and would do something if they didn't feel alone or didn't feel threatened and
Yeah.
weren't scared. Like you said, the ignorance is bliss, but I think a lot of people are so anxious and traumatized from just the news and the different ways of propaganda, coming at us all the time, making us hate each other and making us really
Yeah.
internalize ourselves
True.
that they sort of just cower down and don't feel connected to causes that they care about. But I really hope that people continue to hear your voice and it sparks that courage in them and that they too might just be one person, but that, they can move mountains and cause tornadoes, and take down people who, are doing bad things and who are colluding with cover-ups of just heinous, horrific crimes that have just gone on for so long. And so for
Well,
people, oh, go ahead.
oh yeah. Well, I was just going to say something that will encourage what you're saying is I should let you know and people know that I'm going over to Europe to help the court case when it opens on September 1st against this present Pope, Robert Prevost, so-called Pope Leo. And as part of that, I'm doing speaking tour across Canada, then down into the States. and that'll be in August. And so if you'd like to book me in, especially in the eastern states, I've got a lot of support in there and a lot of groups I work with. So please, let's arrange some speaking events, and I can come and encourage people directly. That'd be awesome. And we can talk about that later, but how to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For the person on the other side of the screen that does want to help and is scared, do you have any words for them of what got you through that fear yourself?
Yeah, I can give you a story, a short story. When I was, one of the things that led me to this was in the 80s, I went down to Guatemala to check out the refugee camps there, the Mayan Indians who had been brutalized and massacred in Guatemala over the years. And I met a defraud Catholic priest called Brother Fidel. And the Catholic bishop had thrown him out, like I would be one day, for working with the native people. And every day there were attacks from the Guatemalan army on the refugee camp, right? And I said to him, do you ever get scared? Because his name was on a death list, on a hit list. And they knew they were gunning for him. And I said, do you ever get scared? And he said, yeah, all the time. I want to get in my Land Rover and drive away. And I say, what stops you? And he said, whenever I get scared, I go to the poorest child in the camp and I just look at her and I realize she can't get away. And she gives me the courage to last another day. And I think it's making the journey from here to here, because the mind will always tell you reasons not to do something, right? But our heart won't do that. Our heart says, if we don't act, she's going to die. And that's what's going to lead us. And kind of our heart mind, not our, often our rational mind is just so easily controlled and influenced. But here we know what to do. And once you act on that, you open an amazing door and hope among hundreds of people, you know, that who you'll never even meet. But you've got to light that torch, but you've got to be the torch and you've got to go through the fire to do that. But I've done it, and I want to encourage people. That's why I want to come and speak to people, because it's best face to face on this. And so anyway, I hope that helps.
What a touching story. And for the person on the other side of the screen that does want to get in contact with you or who wants to connect with you, what's the best way that they can reach out to you directly?
Well, I'll give you my emails, angelfire101@protonmail.com. My phone number is 289-680-8724. And I would say just, study everything online and get on board, because our future depends on it and our children depend on it.
Beautiful closing words. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for never giving up as well, Kevin. I know, like I said, you've had so much coming against you. You've had every obstacle put in your path trying to stop you and silence you. And you're that rare hero that, goes into the fire to save people when everybody else is running out to save themselves. So thank you from my heart and from everybody's heart for your continued work. And, I'm excited to have you back on to dive more into this.
Love to.
And so for everybody listening, I'm going to have all Kevin's information. I'll have his phone number below, his email, all the websites, the documentary, the links to get his books, all the different websites that I showed today in the show notes. You guys can go down no matter what platform you're on and just click and go and copy and paste his email, copy and paste his phone number into your phone, reach out directly to him. I do encourage you guys, I know it can be scary to think about taking action, but even just sharing a website, even just going and listening to one of his broadcasts and sharing it with a friend or on your social media, those things can be enormously helpful for whistleblowers, for survivors, to help get this information out when it's being so suppressed. And it's something that's free, it's something that's very easy, and it's something that you can do in just a couple seconds. So I really encourage you guys to do that. Get his books, give them to a friend, give them as a gift to somebody who's waking up to this stuff. Put them in your own library and share them with people who come over to your home. There are a lot of ways that we can do something. And I always say go directly to the people helping and ask them how you can help. And those are some really easy ways. So I encourage you guys to connect with Kevin, support his work, share and watch his documentary. And I can't thank you guys enough for everything. I'm going to have all my information in the show notes as well. Kevin, thank you again for coming on today.
Thank you.
And for everybody listening, thank you so much for listening. Couldn't do this without you. God bless you all, and we will see you next time.